Hey there, history lovers. Today we're cracking open a story so wild, so packed with conspiracy, betrayal, and cold hard cash that if Netflix pitched it, you'd say, nah, too unrealistic. We're talking about the Knights Templar, a bunch of guys who started out as basically medieval Uber drivers for pilgrims and somehow ended up becoming the richest, most powerful, and most mysterious organization in Europe. They invented banking before banking was cool, they answered to no one except the Pope himself, and then poof, they vanished in a blaze of accusations so bizarre they'd make a tabloid journalist blush. Idols? Secret rituals? Treasure maps? Oh, we're going there. 9 centuries later, and we still can't stop talking about these guys. They've inspired everything from secret societies to Hollywood blockbusters to your uncle's favourite conspiracy theory at Thanksgiving dinner. But here's the thing, the real story? It's way more interesting than the fiction. We're talking political chess games, torture chambers, a king with an empty wallet and zero chill, and a curse that allegedly took down an entire dynasty. You literally cannot make this stuff up, so smash that like button if you're ready for a deep dive into medieval madness, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? I want to know which corners of the globe are tuning in for this epic tale of holy warriors, shady banking, and one very dramatic bonfire. Let's get into it. Alright, to understand how a bunch of warrior monks ended up running the medieval equivalent of Goldman Sachs, we need to rewind the clock, way back. We're talking the 11th century, a time when Europe was basically a chaotic mess of feuding lords, terrified peasants, and a church desperately trying to keep everyone from murdering each other long enough to attend Sunday Mass. Spoiler alert, it wasn't working great. Picture Europe around the year 1000 and change. If you're imagining grand castles and chivalrous knights rescuing damsels, I'm going to need you to dial those expectations way down. Most of Europe looked less like a fairy tale and more like a survival horror game with extra mud. The Roman Empire had been gone for centuries, and what replaced it was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and territories run by whoever had the biggest sword and the fewest moral qualms about using it. Central authority was basically a suggestion. Law enforcement was whoever shows up with more men wins, and the average person's life expectancy was somewhere between surprisingly short and yikes. Good luck finding reliable healthcare. Sanitation, or really any of the basic amenities we take for granted, like, say, not dying from a minor infection. The feudal system was in full swing, which meant society was structured like a very depressing pyramid. At the top you had kings and high nobles living in relative comfort, if you can call drafty stone fortresses comfortable. Below them, lesser nobles and knights who spent most of their time fighting each other over land, honour, or sometimes just because it was Tuesday and they were bored. And at the bottom, making up roughly 90% of the population, peasants who worked the land, paid taxes to everyone above them, and generally existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion and mild terror. Social mobility was not exactly a thing. If you were born a serf, congratulations, you were going to die a serf, and so were your kids, and their kids, and basically everyone in your family tree until the end of time. The medieval dream was less work hard and get ahead, and more work hard and maybe don't starve this winter. But here's where things get interesting. While the average European was busy trying to survive another plague outbreak or dodge the local lord's tax collectors, something was brewing in the halls of power. The Catholic Church, which was the closest thing medieval Europe had to a unifying institution, was looking at the state of Christendom and not loving what it saw. Violence was everywhere. Knights were constantly fighting, pillaging, and generally making nuisances of themselves. The Church had tried various approaches to calm things down. The peace of God, the truce of God, basically a series of increasingly desperate attempts to get armed men to stop killing each other, at least on holy days. Results were mixed, to put it charitably. You can only tell a medieval knight to chill so many times before you realise he's not really built for chilling. Meanwhile, over in the east, things were getting complicated. The Byzantine Empire, that's the eastern half of the old Roman Empire that managed to keep going while the west collapsed, was having a rough century. For hundreds of years they'd been the shield of Christendom, holding the line against various invaders and keeping Constantinople as one of the most magnificent cities in the world. But by the late 11th century they were in trouble. A relatively new power had emerged from Central Asia and was rapidly expanding, the Seljuk Turks. These guys were serious warriors, and in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, they handed the Byzantine army one of the most devastating defeats in its long history. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV was captured on the battlefield, not a great look for the supposedly invincible Roman military tradition. After Manzikert, Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey, and it had been Byzantine heartland for centuries, started slipping away. Turkish tribes moved in, Byzantine control crumbled, and suddenly the empire that had seemed eternal was looking very mortal. The new Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, took stock of the situation and made a fateful decision. He would ask the West for help. Specifically, he would ask the Pope. Now, this was a big deal. The relationship between the Eastern Orthodox Church centered in Constantinople and the Roman Catholic Church centered in Rome had been rocky for a long time. They'd actually split completely in 1054 in what historians call the Great Schism, arguing over theological differences and, let's be honest, a whole lot of political ego on both sides. So Alexios reaching out to Rome was swallowing some serious pride. He wasn't asking for a full-scale invasion or a holy war. He mainly wanted some mercenaries, professional soldiers who could help him push back the Turks. What he got instead was something nobody anticipated, least of all him. Enter Pope Urban II, one of the most consequential figures in medieval history, even if he doesn't get the name recognition of some flashier characters. Urban was smart, politically savvy, and facing his own problems. There was actually a rival pope at the time, because medieval church politics were absolutely bonkers, and Urban needed to strengthen his position. When Alexios's request for military aid arrived, Urban saw an opportunity that went way beyond sending a few mercenaries east. In November 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a huge crowd at the Council of Clermont in France and delivered a speech that would change the course of history. We don't have an exact transcript. Medieval recording technology was somewhat lacking, but multiple chroniclers wrote down what they remembered, and the gist was this: the Holy Land, the sacred sites where Jesus walked and died, was in the hands of infidels. Christian pilgrims were being mistreated, holy places desecrated. It was the duty of every good Christian to take up arms and reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom. And here's the kicker: anyone who died on this holy mission would receive automatic remission of all their sins. That's right, a guaranteed ticket to heaven, no confession required, do not pass purgatory, go directly to eternal paradise. The crowd went absolutely wild. Deus vult, they shouted, God wills it. And just like that, the First Crusade was born. Within months, tens of thousands of Europeans were preparing to march east. Some were nobles and trained knights who saw a chance for glory, land, and salvation all rolled into one attractive package. Some were common people swept up in religious fervour, convinced that they were living in the end times and that this was their chance to be part of something bigger than their miserable daily existence. Some were younger sons of noble families who wouldn't inherit anything back home and figured carving out territory in the East beat staying poor in Europe. And yes, some were criminals, debtors, and general troublemakers who saw the Crusade as a convenient way to escape their problems, the medieval equivalent of joining the Foreign Legion to outrun your past. The motivations were as mixed as the people themselves. Religious devotion was real and shouldn't be underestimated. These were deeply pious times, and the idea of liberating the places where Christ himself had lived was genuinely moving to many. But let's not pretend everyone was purely motivated by spiritual concerns. The promise of wealth, land, and adventure was definitely part of the appeal. Chronicles talk about the riches of the East, the fabulous cities, the chance to make your fortune far from the cramped and exhausted lands of Europe. For knights who spent their lives training for war but had limited opportunities to actually use those skills productively, a holy war in a distant land was practically a dream come true. You get to do what you're good at, you get rich doing it, and you go to heaven. Sign me up. The First Crusade was a logistical nightmare from the start. Tens of thousands of people decided to march roughly 3,000 kilometers across foreign territory, much of it hostile, with medieval supply chains and communication methods, which is to say, terrible supply chains and communication methods. Multiple armies set out separately, taking different routes, sometimes fighting with each other when they met, definitely fighting with the local populations along the way. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, who had asked for maybe a few thousand disciplined mercenaries, suddenly had hundreds of thousands of armed pilgrims showing up at his doorstep, expecting food, supplies, and directions to Jerusalem. His reaction was probably something along the lines of, "This is not what I ordered." The journey east was brutal. Many crusaders died before they ever saw the Holy Land, from disease, starvation, fighting, or just the sheer physical demands of medieval long-distance travel. Remember, this is a world without paved highways, reliable maps, or any of the infrastructure we associate with moving large groups of people. You walked. You walked through mountains, deserts, and enemy territory. You ate whatever you could find or take. You drank water from rivers and hoped you wouldn't get dysentery, though statistically speaking, you probably would. The romantic image of crusaders as gleaming knights on magnificent horses needs some serious revision. By the time most of them got anywhere near Jerusalem, they looked more like refugees than conquerors. And then there were the less savoury elements of this great holy expedition. Before the main crusader armies even left Europe, mobs of peasants and lower-class crusaders started attacking Jewish communities along the Rhine River. Thousands of Jews were massacred in what historians call the Rhineland massacres, a horrifying preview of centuries of European anti-Semitism to come. The logic, if you can call it that, was brutal. Why march all the way to the east to fight enemies of Christ when there were infidels right here at home? It was murder wrapped in religious justification, and it stains the crusading movement from its very inception. But despite the chaos, the deaths, and the atrocities, the First Crusade actually succeeded, against all reasonable expectations. The Crusader armies that made it to the Middle East managed to capture Antioch in 1098 after a brutal siege, and then in July 1099 they took Jerusalem itself. The city that had been the goal of this entire mad enterprise, the most sacred city in Christendom, was once again in Christian hands. The fall of Jerusalem was celebrated across Europe as a miracle. And in a way, it kind of was. Nobody should have expected this ragtag collection of armies, weakened by the journey and fighting each other almost as much as the enemy, to actually pull it off. But they did. The Crusaders established what historians call the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. Suddenly there were European-ruled territories in the heart of the Middle East, tiny Christian kingdoms surrounded by a Muslim world that was, understandably, not thrilled about the situation. Here's where our story really begins to pick up speed. Because while taking Jerusalem was hard, keeping it was going to be even harder. The Crusader states were tiny. Their combined population was a fraction of the Muslim territories surrounding them. The Crusaders who had fought to get there often went home after their pilgrimage was complete. Mission accomplished. Time to go back to France or Germany or wherever, and enjoy that guaranteed salvation. What was left was a small ruling class of European nobles trying to hold on to territories that stretched along the Mediterranean coast like a thin, vulnerable ribbon. Pilgrims kept coming, of course. The roads to Jerusalem were open now, and thousands of Christians wanted to walk where Jesus had walked, to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to touch the sacred stones of the Holy City. But getting there was incredibly dangerous. The Crusaders controlled the cities and some fortifications, but the roads between them were another matter entirely. Bandits, local resistance fighters, and just the general chaos of a land that had recently been conquered made travelling in the Holy Land a genuinely life-threatening activity. Pilgrims were being robbed and killed on the roads in significant numbers. And this is the moment, this precise set of circumstances, vulnerable Crusader states, dangerous roads, thousands of pilgrims needing protection, that created the conditions for something new, something unprecedented. In the years following the conquest of Jerusalem, a small group of knights would come together with an idea that seemed almost paradoxical. Warriors who were also monks, soldiers who took religious vows, fighters dedicated to protecting the innocent, while living lives of prayer and poverty. They would call themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would remember them simply as the Knights Templar. The stage was set. Europe had launched its great holy war, Jerusalem had fallen, and now fragile Christian kingdoms needed defending. Religious fervour mixed with military necessity, idealism mixed with brutal pragmatism. Out of this chaos would emerge an order that would grow to become one of the most powerful, wealthy, and mysterious organizations the medieval world had ever seen. An order whose rise and fall would captivate the imagination of humanity for centuries to come. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, just picture the scene. Dusty roads winding through hostile territory, pilgrims travelling in fear, and a handful of knights with a revolutionary idea. The world was about to change, and it all started with a few men, some swords, and a whole lot of faith. Or maybe ambition. Probably both, if we're being honest about human nature. So let's zoom in on that pivotal moment in the summer of 1099, because what happened at Jerusalem wasn't just a military victory, it was an event so brutal, so drenched in blood and religious ecstasy, that it would define the crusading movement for centuries to come. And honestly, it's one of those historical moments that makes you realize just how complicated human beings really are. By the time the Crusader army arrived at the walls of Jerusalem in June 1099, they were a shadow of the force that had left Europe 3 years earlier. Disease, starvation, combat, and desertion had whittled down their numbers dramatically. Estimates vary, but we're probably talking about somewhere between 12 and 15,000 fighting men, including maybe 12 to 1,300 knights. Not exactly an overwhelming force to assault one of the most fortified cities in the world, a city that had been conquered and reconquered throughout history, precisely because everyone understood its strategic and symbolic importance. The Fatimid garrison defending Jerusalem knew the Crusaders were coming and had prepared accordingly. They'd poisoned or blocked wells outside the city to deny the attackers water, a particularly nasty tactic in the Middle Eastern summer heat, where temperatures could soar to genuinely unbearable levels. They'd also expelled the Christian population from the city, partly to prevent any inside help for the attackers, and partly because, well, they didn't exactly trust them under the circumstances. The Crusaders found themselves besieging a well-prepared fortress in hostile terrain, running low on supplies, with summer heat baking them in their armour. Not exactly ideal conditions for a prolonged military operation. The siege was a desperate affair from the start. The Crusaders lacked proper siege equipment. Building siege towers and battering rams requires wood, and Palestine isn't exactly known for its abundant forests. They were essentially trying to take one of the great fortified cities of the medieval world with determination, faith, and not much else. For weeks they probed the defences, launched unsuccessful assaults, and watched their men die from heat, thirst, and the arrows of the defenders. Morale was cratering. Some Crusaders were ready to give up and go home, assuming they could even make it home at this point, which was far from certain. Then came what the Crusaders interpreted as divine intervention. A priest claimed to have received a vision. If the army fasted, prayed, and marched barefoot around the city walls like the Israelites at Jericho, God would deliver Jerusalem into their hands. Was this genuine religious fervour? Mass delusion? A clever morale-boosting tactic by someone who understood medieval psychology? Probably a combination of all three. Whatever the motivation, it worked. On July 8th, the ragged, starving Crusader army processed around Jerusalem's walls, priests chanting, crosses held high, while the defenders on the walls mocked them and probably questioned their sanity. Fair enough, honestly. But then the situation changed dramatically. Genoese ships arrived at the port of Jaffa carrying supplies, and crucially, materials for building siege equipment. The Crusaders threw themselves into construction with renewed energy. Within days, they had assembled siege towers, massive wooden structures on wheels designed to roll up to walls and allow attackers to fight the defenders at their own level. It wasn't elegant engineering by any standard, but it was functional, and that's what mattered. The final assault came on July 15th, 1099. The fighting was intense and chaotic, the kind of close-quarters medieval combat that makes you grateful to live in an era of conflict resolution through strongly worded emails. The Crusaders attacked from multiple points, stretching the defenders thin. At a crucial moment, one of the siege towers managed to bridge the wall near the northeastern corner of the city. The first Crusaders scrambled across, established a foothold, and suddenly the defence began to collapse. Once attackers are inside your walls, you've got a serious problem, and the Fatimid garrison had a very serious problem indeed. What followed was one of the most infamous massacres in medieval history. The Crusaders, finally inside the city they'd travelled years and thousands of kilometres to reach, went absolutely berserk. They killed everyone they could find, men, women, children, it didn't matter. Muslim residents were slaughtered in the streets, in their homes, in the mosques where they'd fled seeking sanctuary. The Jewish population, which had taken refuge in the main synagogue, was burned alive when the Crusaders set the building on fire. It was systematic, frenzied, and utterly merciless. The chroniclers who wrote about the fall of Jerusalem were Crusaders themselves or sympathetic to the crusading cause, Yet even they describe the carnage in terms that are hard to read even 9 centuries later. One famous account claims that the blood of the slain rose to the knees of the riders, even to the bridles of their horses. Is this literally true? Almost certainly not. That's an absolutely preposterous amount of blood that would require physics-defying quantities of victims. But as a description of emotional truth, of what it felt like to witness that massacre, it's probably accurate enough. The streets ran red. The killing went on for hours, maybe days. Conservative estimates put the death toll in the thousands. Some historians argue for much higher numbers. And here's where it gets psychologically fascinating in a deeply disturbing way. After the killing stopped, after the Crusaders had quite literally waded through corpses, they cleaned themselves up, put on fresh clothes, and walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Jesus was believed to have been, crucified and buried to give thanks to God for their victory. They wept with joy. They prayed with genuine devotion. They saw no contradiction whatsoever between the mass murder they had just committed and the religious ecstasy they now felt. In their minds, they had done God's work. They had liberated the holiest site in Christendom. The deaths of infidels weren't sins to be confessed. They were offerings to the divine. Try to wrap your head around that for a moment. These weren't sociopaths, at least not in any clinical sense. They were products of their time, their culture, their deeply held beliefs about the nature of God, salvation, and the cosmic struggle between good and evil. They genuinely believed that killing non-Christians in service of reclaiming Jerusalem was not just acceptable, but meritorious. It would earn them salvation. Modern sensibilities recoil from this, as they absolutely should. But understanding it is crucial for understanding the Crusades and everything that followed, including the Templars. The immediate aftermath of the conquest presented a whole new set of problems. Jerusalem was taken, the holy sites were in Christian hands, mission accomplished, except that most of the Crusaders wanted to go home. They'd fulfilled their vows, earned their salvation, and had absolutely zero interest in staying in this hot, hostile, unfamiliar land when they could return to Europe as heroes. And return they did, in droves. Within months of the Great Victory, the Crusader population of the Holy Land had shrunk to a tiny fraction of the conquering army. This created an existential crisis for the newly established Crusader states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which sounds grand but was really more like a thin strip of coastal territory with some inland fortifications, was surrounded by Muslim powers that were temporarily divided and disorganized but wouldn't stay that way forever. The county of Edessa to the north, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, all of these Crusader territories faced the same fundamental problem. They were isolated European outposts in a region where Europeans were vastly outnumbered and profoundly unwelcome. The population math was brutal. The entire Frankish population of the Crusader states, nobles, knights, merchants, clergy, everyone, probably never exceeded about 150,000 at its peak, spread across territories that required constant military defense. Compare that to the millions of Muslims in the surrounding regions. This wasn't a sustainable situation by any normal military calculus. The Crusaders needed every advantage they could get, every innovation in organization and warfare just to survive. And survive they had to, because giving up Jerusalem was simply not an option. The entire crusading enterprise, the massive sacrifice of lives and treasure, the religious fervour that had driven tens of thousands to march across the known world, all of it depended on holding on to the holy city. Losing it would be more than a military defeat. It would be a spiritual catastrophe, a sign that God had withdrawn his favour. The psychological pressure on the defenders of the Crusader states was immense. This is the context you need to understand for what came next. A desperate military situation, a tiny population of European transplants in hostile territory, roads between cities and fortifications that were essentially death traps for anyone travelling without armed escort, and pilgrims, thousands of pilgrims, still coming to visit the holy sites, motivated by the same religious devotion that had launched the crusade in the first place, but now travelling through a war zone where bandits, hostile locals and the general. Chaos of a conquered land made every journey potentially fatal. Something had to be done. And in this crucible of violence, faith and desperation, a handful of men would propose a solution so radical, so unprecedented, that it would scandalize some and inspire others. They would create something the world had never seen before. Warriors who were also monks, soldiers who lived by religious vows, killers who considered themselves servants of God in the most literal sense imaginable. Now we need to talk about one of the strangest ideas in medieval history, an idea so counterintuitive that it scandalized contemporaries even as it captured their imagination. The warrior monk, the fighting friar, the knight who kills for Christ. It sounds like a contradiction in terms because honestly it kind of was, and yet this paradox would become the foundation for one of the most powerful organizations the medieval world ever produced. To understand why this was such a big deal, you need to understand how medieval Christianity thought about violence. The early church had been, in theory at least, strongly pacifist. Thou shalt not kill was pretty clear, and early Christian thinkers generally interpreted it to mean that Christians shouldn't be soldiers, shouldn't participate in warfare, shouldn't take human life under any circumstances. Obviously this got complicated once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Hard to run an empire without an army. But the moral tension never fully went away. Killing was sinful. Warriors who killed, even in just wars, were supposed to do penance for the lives they'd taken. The church might bless armies and sanctify certain conflicts, but there was always an acknowledgement that bloodshed was, at best, a necessary evil. Monks, meanwhile, were the spiritual elite of medieval Christianity. They'd renounced the world, wealth, family, secular ambition, to devote themselves entirely to God. They lived in monasteries, following strict rules that governed every aspect of their existence. They prayed multiple times a day at set hours, observed periods of silence, fasted regularly, and generally tried to live as close to angelic perfection as humans possibly could. The monastic life was considered the highest calling, the surest path to salvation, precisely because it involved complete withdrawal from worldly concerns, including, very much including, violence. So when you think about it, the concepts of monk and warrior shouldn't go together at all. One is dedicated to peace, prayer, and spiritual contemplation. The other is dedicated to violence, combat, and physical action. Putting them together is like combining fire and water, or cats and dogs, or quiet contemplation and death metal. It shouldn't work. Medieval theologians said it shouldn't work. Some called the very idea an abomination, a monstrous hybrid that violated the natural order of both religious and secular life. And yet, the conditions in the Holy Land after the First Crusade created exactly the right pressure cooker for this impossible fusion to happen. The Crusaders had succeeded militarily but failed demographically. There weren't enough knights to protect the territory, there weren't enough soldiers to guard the roads, and the regular feudal arrangements that structured military service in Europe didn't translate well to the unique situation of an isolated Christian enclave in the Middle East. Back in France or Germany, a knight owed military service to his lord for a certain number of days per year, after which he went home to manage his estates. That model doesn't work when you're surrounded by enemies and every day is potentially a day when the entire kingdom might need defending. What the Crusader states needed was a permanent military force, professionals who would dedicate their entire lives to defence, who wouldn't go home after their 40 days of service, who would be available year-round for whatever threats emerged. But maintaining professional soldiers is expensive, and the Crusader states were not exactly swimming in cash. They needed motivated fighters who would serve not for money but for something else, something more powerful than gold. Enter the solution that shouldn't have worked but somehow did: religious dedication. What if knights took monastic vows? What if they committed to a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the traditional monastic triple vow? But instead of spending their days in prayer and contemplation, they spent them defending pilgrims and fighting the enemies of Christ. They'd be motivated by faith rather than pay. They'd be bound by sacred oaths rather than feudal contracts. They'd be permanent, dedicated, and absolutely committed to the mission. The theological gymnastics required to justify this were impressive. Fortunately, the Church had been developing just such justifications for centuries, even if they'd never been pushed quite this far. St. Augustine had articulated the concept of the just war, the idea that under certain circumstances warfare could be morally acceptable, even necessary. The Crusade itself had been proclaimed a holy war, with participants promised spiritual rewards for their military service. The key insight of the military orders was to take this logic to its extreme conclusion. If fighting for Christ could earn you salvation, then perhaps fighting for Christ could be your entire vocation, your worship, your monastic discipline. One medieval thinker put it this way: these men were engaged in a new kind of warfare unknown to previous ages. They were neither fully monks nor fully knights, but something unprecedented, a hybrid that combined the spiritual discipline of the cloister with the martial prowess of the battlefield. An English chronicler, watching this new phenomenon emerge, called them a certain new monster, and honestly, that's not a bad description. They were monstrous in the original sense of the word, something extraordinary, something that defied normal categories, something that made people stop and stare. The practical implications of this fusion were enormous. Monks took vows of poverty, which meant individual members couldn't accumulate personal wealth, but the order as an institution could. Monks took vows of obedience, which meant military discipline could be enforced as a religious obligation. Disobey your commander, and you're not just a bad soldier, you're a sinner. Monks took vows of chastity, which meant no families, no heirs, no divided loyalties. Your only family was the brotherhood. Your only loyalty was to the order and its mission. This created soldiers who were, in many ways, the perfect medieval warriors. They couldn't be bribed because they'd renounced personal wealth. They couldn't be distracted by family concerns because they had no families. They couldn't be intimidated by death because they believed martyrdom in battle guaranteed salvation. And they maintained strict discipline not because they feared punishment from their commanders, but because they feared divine judgment for breaking their sacred vows. Try building that kind of motivation into a regular mercenary contract. The first military order wasn't actually the Templars, it was the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Order of St. John, who had started as a charitable organisation running a hospital for pilgrims in Jerusalem and gradually took on military functions. But the Templars would be the first order founded specifically and explicitly for military purposes. They emerged in the years following the conquest of Jerusalem, initially as an informal brotherhood of knights dedicated to protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. The founders were a small group, tradition says 9 knights, though the exact number is debated, led by a French nobleman named Hugh de Payon. Their origins are somewhat murky, lost in the imprecise record-keeping of the early 12th century, but the general outline is clear enough. These men approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem sometime around 1119 or 1120 and proposed their unusual arrangement. They would live as monks, following religious rules, but their ministry would be military rather than contemplative. They would patrol the roads, escort pilgrims, and fight anyone who threatened the Christian presence in the Holy Land. Baldwin, facing the desperate military situation we've already discussed, was not about to turn down free dedicated warriors. He gave them quarters in his own palace, which happened to be built on the Temple Mount, the site where Solomon's temple had once stood, one of the holiest locations in Jerusalem. This is where the name came from. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, eventually shortened to just the Templars. Not exactly a snappy brand name, but it stuck. The early years were humble, even austere. The original Templars were genuinely poor, sharing horses and equipment because they couldn't afford individual supplies. Their early seal, which would become famous later, showed 2 knights riding a single horse, a symbol of poverty that was also frankly a practical reality. They lived in poverty, they ate simple food, they followed strict religious rules. If you told them that their little brotherhood would eventually become one of the richest and most powerful organizations in medieval Europe, they probably would have thought you were crazy. But here's the thing about good ideas in the right conditions: they spread. Word of the Templars reached Europe and the concept captured imaginations. Here was something new, something dramatic, something that seemed to resolve the eternal tension between martial prowess and spiritual devotion. Young knights who wanted to serve God but also wanted to actually do something with their combat training now had an option. Wealthy nobles who wanted to support the crusading cause but couldn't go east themselves could donate to the Templars and feel like they were contributing to something meaningful. The true transformation came when Hugh de Payon travelled to Europe in 1127 to 1128 to recruit members and seek official church recognition for his order. He found a powerful ally in Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the age, a man so persuasive that he could essentially talk people into doing whatever he wanted through sheer force of personality and theological eloquence. Bernard threw his weight behind the Templars, writing a treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood that provided the theological justification for their existence. Bernard's argument was clever. Regular knights, he said, were vain and worldly. They fought for glory, for wealth, for women's favour. They decorated themselves in fine silks and gold, curled their hair like ladies, fought meaningless tournaments to show off. This worldly knighthood was at best a waste and at worst a path to damnation. But the Templars were different. They fought not for themselves but for Christ. They dressed simply, lived humbly, and sought no glory except the glory of God. They were doing holy work in a martial form. They were, Bernard argued, not just acceptable, they were admirable. They were what knights should be. The Church, persuaded by Bernard and recognising the practical value of the Templars' mission, gave official approval at the Council of Troy in 1129. The order received its own rule, a set of regulations governing how members should live, based on the Cistercian monastic rule but adapted for warriors. They were granted remarkable privileges, including exemption from local taxes and the authority to answer only to the Pope, bypassing all local bishops and secular rulers. This independence would prove crucial to their future power, and eventually to their downfall. The warrior monk had gone from impossible contradiction to officially sanctioned institution. The monster, as that English chronicler called it, now had the Pope's blessing and a license to operate across Christendom. What had started as 9 poor knights sharing horses in Jerusalem was about to become something no one could have predicted. A medieval multinational corporation with interests spanning from the Holy Land to the British Isles, from the battlefields of the Crusades to the financial centres of Europe. The Templars were officially in business, and business, as we'll see, was about to get very, very good. So we've established that the Templars got official church approval and a fancy theological justification for their existence. But what did that actually look like on the ground? What was daily life like for these warrior monks in the early years, when they were still figuring out how to be soldiers and monks at the same time? Spoiler alert, it was weird, it was hard, and it was absolutely nothing like the glamorous image that would develop later. Let's back up and paint the picture of what the original Templars were actually dealing with. The roads of the Holy Land in the early 12th century were essentially medieval murder highways. Not to be dramatic, but actually yes to be dramatic, because the reality was genuinely terrifying. Pilgrims travelling from the port of Jaffa to Jerusalem, a journey of roughly 50 kilometres, faced bandits, hostile locals, wild animals, and the ever-present threat of organised Muslim raiding parties looking to capture Christians for ransom or worse. Contemporary sources describe finding pilgrim corpses along the roadsides, stripped of valuables, left for the vultures. This wasn't paranoid exaggeration, this was Tuesday. The early Templars positioned themselves as the solution to this problem. Their daily routine was a bizarre blend of monastery and military base. They rose before dawn for the first prayers of the day, matins followed by prime as the sun came up, just like regular monks. But instead of spending the morning copying manuscripts or tending gardens, they'd gear up, mount their horses, and head out to patrol the dangerous stretches of road where pilgrims were most vulnerable. Imagine a combination of SWAT team and prayer group, but everyone's wearing chainmail and hasn't showered in weeks, not exactly the spa retreat version of monastic life. The Rule of the Templars, the document that governed their daily existence, was fascinatingly specific about how they should live. Members ate meals in silence, listening to scripture being read aloud, standard monastic practice. But the rule also specified that knights should eat meat 3 times a week to maintain their strength for combat, which was actually more generous than many monastic diets. They slept in dormitories, fully clothed and with a light burning, ready to respond to any alarm. Privacy was essentially non-existent. Even going to the bathroom was supposed to be done in pairs, which sounds awkward until you remember that isolated individuals were vulnerable to attack. The medieval buddy system, but make it armed. Personal possessions were strictly limited. A Templar knight was allowed his weapons, his armour, his horse, actually multiple horses because medieval warfare was hard on the animals, and basic necessities like a blanket and a bowl. That's it. No personal luxuries, no family heirlooms, no comfortable extras. Everything belonged to the order, and members owned nothing individually. This wasn't just spiritual discipline, it was also incredibly practical. Dead knights don't need inheritance disputes, and men with nothing to lose fight differently than men worried about their stuff back home. The early recruitment strategy was surprisingly sophisticated for a medieval organisation. Hugh de Payens and his companions understood that they needed 2 things to grow: warm bodies who could fight, and money to equip and feed those bodies. They couldn't pay soldiers. They were monks, remember, committed to institutional if not personal poverty. So they had to attract men who would serve for spiritual rewards rather than earthly ones. This meant recruiting knights who were genuinely motivated by faith, or at least knights who wanted everyone to think they were genuinely motivated by faith. The medieval equivalent of building a brand around values, except the values involved swords. When Hugh travelled to Europe in 1127, he wasn't just looking for church approval, he was on a medieval recruitment and fundraising tour. He visited courts, gave speeches, met with nobles, and basically pitched the Templar concept to anyone who would listen, and people listened. The idea of holy warriors defending pilgrims captured imaginations across Europe. Young knights who'd heard stories of the Crusades but hadn't been able to participate saw the Templars as their chance to join something meaningful. Older nobles who couldn't fight themselves but wanted to support the cause saw the Templars as a worthy recipient of their charity. The donations started flowing in. Land, money, equipment, entire estates. Wealthy Christians across Europe gave generously to support the Templars' mission. This created an interesting economic model. The order operated on two tracks simultaneously: a fighting force in the Holy Land that consumed resources, and a network of properties in Europe that generated them. The European holdings, farms, vineyards, mills, houses, were managed by Templars who would never see combat, producing income that was funneled to the brothers fighting on the frontier. It was essentially a medieval military-industrial complex, except the industry was agriculture and the product was holy warriors. The growth was explosive by medieval standards. Within a few decades of their founding, the Templars had expanded from that original handful of knights sharing horses to an organization with thousands of members spread across Europe and the Middle East. They had properties in France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, basically everywhere Christianity held sway. Local chapters, called commanderies or preceptories, dotted the landscape, each one a combination of monastery, military training facility, and economic enterprise. But let's not romanticize this too much. Life as a Templar was hard, often boring, and frequently ended violently. The brothers in Europe might spend years managing farms and collecting rents, which sounds less like holy warfare and more like medieval middle management. The brothers in the Holy Land faced combat, disease, and the constant stress of living in hostile territory. The vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience weren't just pious abstractions. They were enforced, and violations could result in harsh punishments. Getting caught with a woman, for instance, could mean losing the habit and being expelled from the order in disgrace. The rules specified elaborate disciplinary procedures for various infractions, from eating meat on the wrong day to abandoning your post in battle. The combat reputation of the Templars developed gradually through actual performance in battle. They became known for discipline, ferocity, and an almost suicidal willingness to fight to the death. Part of this was theological. Dying in battle against infidels was understood as martyrdom, a guaranteed ticket to paradise. Part of it was practical. The rule forbade retreat unless the odds were truly hopeless, and even then only with permission. A Templar force wouldn't break and run the way regular feudal armies sometimes did when the fighting got tough. They'd stand, fight, and die if necessary. This reliability made them incredibly valuable military assets. Crusader kings and commanders learned that Templar units could be trusted to hold the line, to charge when ordered, to maintain formation under pressure. In an era when military discipline was often lacking, when feudal knights fought as individuals seeking personal glory rather than as coordinated units, the Templars stood out. They were the closest thing the medieval period had to professional soldiers, and everyone who fought alongside them or against them recognized it. The Muslim sources are particularly interesting on this point. Chronicles from the other side of the conflict describe the Templars with a mixture of hatred and respect. They were dangerous enemies, fanatical in their devotion, impossible to negotiate with because they'd refuse prisoner exchanges and ransom deals. When Saladin captured Templar prisoners after certain battles, he had them executed rather than ransomed, partly because they were too dangerous to release, and partly because their refusal to convert or cooperate made them useless as hostages. The Templars had earned a reputation as the hardest of the hardcore, and they paid for that reputation in blood. By mid-12th century, the Templars had evolved from a small volunteer security patrol into something unprecedented, an international military organization with its own command structure, its own legal privileges, and its own economic resources. They answered to the Pope and nobody else, Not local bishops, not secular kings, nobody. This independence was both their greatest strength and eventually the source of enormous resentment. People don't like organisations they can't control, especially when those organisations have money, soldiers, and immunity from local laws. The original 9 knights on their shared horses would have been astonished, and probably a little alarmed, by what their modest initiative had become. They'd wanted to protect pilgrims. They'd gotten a medieval superpower. Now we get to the part that really sets the Templars apart from other medieval religious organisations, the part that made them genuinely revolutionary and ultimately fatally successful. The Templars invented banking. Not just any banking, international banking, the kind that lets you deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, the kind that makes credit available across borders and currencies, the kind that basically makes modern commerce possible. And they did it 800 years before anyone had heard of Wall Street. Let's start with the basic problem they were trying to solve. You're a medieval pilgrim planning to travel from, say, London to Jerusalem. That's a journey of several thousand kilometres through multiple kingdoms, each with its own currency, its own bandits, and its own opportunities for you to get robbed, kidnapped, or killed. You need money for the journey, for food, lodging, bribes, boat passage, all the expenses that accumulate over months of travel. But carrying large amounts of cash is basically painting a target on your back. Medieval roads were dangerous enough without advertising that you're worth robbing. The Templars looked at this problem and came up with an elegant solution. Instead of carrying your money with you, you could deposit it with the Templars before leaving home. They'd give you a letter, a document describing your deposit, encoded or encrypted to prevent forgery. Then, when you arrived in the Holy Land, you'd present this letter to the Templar establishment there, and they'd give you your money back minus a fee for the service. You'd travel light, unmolested by bandits who didn't know you were secretly wealthy, and your funds would be waiting for you at your destination. This was revolutionary. It sounds simple to us because we live in a world of credit cards and wire transfers, but in the 12th century this was absolutely mind-blowing financial innovation. The Templars had essentially invented the letter of credit, the traveller's cheque, the basic infrastructure of international finance. They'd solved the money transportation problem that had plagued long-distance commerce since the invention of currency. But here's what made it really work: their network. Remember all those commanderies spread across Europe and the Middle East, the properties donated by wealthy Christians, the farms and mills and houses managed by brothers who would never see combat? That network wasn't just an economic resource. It was a physical infrastructure for financial services. Every Templar establishment could potentially function as a branch office, accepting deposits, honouring withdrawals, and transferring funds across the system. The density of this network was remarkable. In some regions, Templar properties were spaced roughly every 30 to 40 kilometres apart, about a day's journey on medieval roads. This meant that travellers could move from one Templar establishment to another with reasonable ease, always having access to secure lodging and financial services. It was like having an ATM network in an age before electricity, a franchise system built on religious devotion rather than profit motive. Unsurprisingly, people found this extremely convenient. The financial services expanded beyond simple deposits and withdrawals. The Templars began offering loans, and their client list was impressive. Not just individual pilgrims, but merchants, nobles, and eventually kings. If you needed capital for a business venture, the Templars could provide it. If you needed to finance a military campaign but your tax revenues wouldn't arrive for months, the Templars could bridge the gap. They became, in essence, the first international bank, and their clients included some of the most powerful people in medieval Europe. The scale of their financial operations grew enormous. Templar treasuries held vast sums, the accumulated deposits of countless pilgrims, the profits from their agricultural holdings, the revenues from their various enterprises. They developed sophisticated accounting systems to track all these transactions across their far-flung network. They had to. You can't run an international bank with medieval technology unless you're extremely organised. Ledgers, records, audits. The Templars pioneered administrative practices that wouldn't become standard in secular banking for centuries. One of their most famous clients was the French crown. The kings of France found the Templars extremely useful as financial managers, to the point where the Templar house in Paris essentially functioned as the royal treasury for extended periods. Royal revenues flowed through Templar hands, royal expenses were paid from Templar vaults. This gave the Templars enormous insight into the financial affairs of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, and it created a relationship that would later prove fatal when a financially desperate king decided the Templars had something he wanted. The ethical dimensions of all this banking activity were fascinating and complicated. Remember, the medieval church officially condemned usury, the charging of interest on loans. Lending money for profit was considered sinful, associated with Jews and other marginalized groups who were allowed to practice it precisely because they were already damned in Christian eyes. So how did the Templars charge fees for their financial services without committing the sin of usury? Through creative interpretation, naturally. The Templars didn't charge interest. They charged fees for services rendered. That letter of credit involved administrative work, after all. Surely a modest payment for that labour was acceptable. Loans came with various built-in costs and penalties that somehow always worked out in the Templars' favour without technically being interest. It was financial engineering at its medieval finest, the kind of theological hair-splitting that makes you appreciate just how clever these guys really were. They'd found a way to run a profitable banking operation while maintaining their status as a religious order, exempt from usury prohibitions. The wealth accumulated by the Templars through these financial operations was staggering. Exact figures are impossible to determine. Medieval accounting, while sophisticated for its time, doesn't meet modern standards of transparency. But contemporary observers clearly thought the Templars were fantastically rich. Their headquarters in major cities were impressive structures. Their military operations were lavishly equipped by medieval standards. They maintained thousands of members across dozens of countries, all of whom needed food, housing, horses, and equipment. This wealth changed how people perceived the order. The original Templars, those 9 knights sharing horses, taking vows of poverty, living on charity, had been admirable in their humility. The later Templars, with their vast properties and overflowing treasuries, were harder to see as humble servants of Christ. Pride, that most dangerous of sins, seemed to be creeping into the order. Critics began to whisper that the Templars cared more about money than about their original mission of protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land. The military situation in the Middle East wasn't helping their reputation either. Despite their financial power and military prowess, the Templars couldn't prevent the gradual erosion of the Crusader states. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, less than a century after the Crusaders had taken it in that bloody triumph of 1099. The Templars fought bravely at the Battle of Hattin, where the Crusader army was destroyed, and many of them died or were executed afterward. But bravery alone couldn't hold territory against superior numbers and competent Muslim leadership. The following decades saw the Crusaders pushed back repeatedly, losing territory despite the best efforts of the military orders. Critics in Europe began to ask uncomfortable questions. What exactly were all these donations accomplishing? The Templars were rich, sure, but the Holy Land was slipping away regardless. Were the military orders actually doing their job, or were they just getting fat on the contributions of the faithful while failing their fundamental mission? This criticism was often unfair. The Templars faced genuinely impossible odds and fought with remarkable tenacity, but it stuck. The combination of visible wealth and visible military failure created a perception problem that would get worse over time. People who had admired the Templars began to resent them. People who had given them money began to wonder if they'd been played, and lurking in the background was an even more dangerous development. The Templars had become creditors to kings, which sounds like a position of power but was actually incredibly risky. Kings don't like owing money. Kings especially don't like owing money to organizations they can't fully control. And kings, unlike ordinary debtors, have armies and legal systems at their disposal when they decide they'd rather not pay their debts. One king in particular was watching the Templars with envious, calculating eyes. A king with an empty treasury, towering debts, and absolutely no moral scruples about how he solved his financial problems. His name was Philip IV of France, and he would bring the entire Templar enterprise crashing down in flames, quite literally. But that's a story for later. For now, just appreciate the irony. The Templars had invented modern banking, built an international financial empire, and become indispensable to the economic life of medieval Europe. And every bit of that success was making them more and more vulnerable to anyone powerful enough and ruthless enough to take it all away. So we've covered how the Templars became military powerhouses and medieval banking moguls. But there's another dimension to their story that we haven't really explored yet. the mystique, the symbols, the secrecy that transformed them from a mere organization into a legend. Because here's the thing, the Templars weren't just rich and dangerous, they were mysterious. And in the medieval mind, mystery plus power plus wealth equals something that's either holy or demonic, with very little room in between. Let's start with the most recognizable element of Templar identity, that iconic white cloak with the red cross. You've seen it in movies, video games, book covers. It's become visual shorthand for medieval holy warrior in popular culture. But the symbolism was carefully chosen and deeply meaningful to the men who wore it. The white mantle came first, granted to the Templars at the Council of Troy in 1129 when the order received official recognition. White represented purity, chastity, the renunciation of worldly pleasures that defined monastic life. When a Templar put on that white cloak, he was making a visible statement about his commitment to spiritual cleanliness. He had left behind the colourful, decorated garments of secular knights. Those guys loved their fancy embroidery and family heraldry, for something deliberately plain and humble, at least in theory. The message was clear: we're not like other knights. We serve a higher purpose. The Red Cross came later, added by Pope Eugenius III around 1147. Red symbolised martyrdom, the blood of Christ, and the willingness of Templars to shed their own blood in defence of the faith. The cross was typically worn over the heart, a constant reminder of the sacrifice at the centre of Christian theology and the sacrifice each Templar was expected to be ready to make. Put the white and red together and you had a powerful visual statement. Purity and blood, spiritual devotion, and martial readiness. The impossible combination that defined the warrior-monk ideal. But uniforms are just the surface level. What really set the Templars apart was their organisational structure. A hierarchy so elaborate and carefully designed that it would make modern corporate consultants weep with admiration. This wasn't some loose brotherhood of like-minded knights. It was a tightly organised institution with clear chains of command, specialised roles, and procedures for basically everything. At the top sat the Grand Master, the supreme leader of the entire order, elected for life by senior members. The Grand Master had enormous power, but wasn't an absolute dictator. Major decisions required consultation with the chapter, an assembly of high-ranking brothers. Below the Grand Master came a series of officers with specific responsibilities. The Seneschal, who served as a kind of deputy Grand Master, the Marshal, who commanded military operations, the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who managed the Order's holdings in the Holy Land, and various other officials handling finance, supplies, and administration. The membership itself was divided into distinct classes, because medieval society loved its hierarchies, and the Templars were no exception. At the top were the Knight Brothers, men of noble birth who had taken full vows and were entitled to wear the white cloak. These were the heavy cavalry, the elite strike force, the guys who charged into battle on war horses and made enemies very nervous. Below them were the Sergeant Brothers, men of non-noble origin who wore black or brown mantles instead of white. They served as light cavalry, infantry, and performed various support roles. Then came the Chaplain Brothers, ordained priests who handled the religious needs of the order, saying Mass, hearing confessions, providing spiritual guidance. Finally, there were various associates, employees, and affiliates who worked for the Templars without being full members. The rules governing daily life were exhaustively detailed. The Templar rule, expanded and refined over the years, specified everything from how brothers should eat, in silence two to a bowl with restricted portions, to how they should care for their horses, very carefully. Horses were expensive and essential, to how they should behave in battle, with absolute discipline and no retreat without permission. There were rules about clothing, about hair, short, no beards initially, though this changed over time, about communication with outsiders, about handling money, about absolutely everything you can imagine, and quite a few things you probably can't. This obsessive regulation served multiple purposes. It maintained discipline in an organisation spread across thousands of kilometres with limited communication technology. It ensured that a Templar in England and a Templar in Jerusalem would follow the same practices, creating institutional coherence. And it reinforced the monastic nature of the order. Monks lived by rules, and the more rules you had, the more monk-like you were. At least that was the theory. In practice, of course, rules are made to be bent if not broken, and the Templars were human beings, not robots. Now we get to the really interesting part. the secrecy. The Templars conducted their internal affairs behind closed doors, and this privacy would eventually become one of the most damning things about them. Their chapter meetings were held in secret, with severe penalties for anyone who revealed what was discussed. Their initiation ceremonies, the rituals by which new members were admitted to the order, were conducted at night in closed chapels with no outside observers. Why the secrecy? Partly it was standard practice for medieval religious orders, which often kept their internal affairs private. Partly it was practical. Military organizations need operational security, and the Templars were managing sensitive information about troop movements, fortifications, and strategic plans. And partly, let's be honest, it was probably about power. Secrecy creates mystique. Mystique creates awe, and awe makes it easier to attract recruits, donations, and respect. The Templars understood medieval marketing, even if they wouldn't have called it that. But secrecy is a double-edged sword. What you don't show people, they imagine. And medieval imaginations were vivid, creative, and often dark. Rumours began to circulate about what exactly happened in those closed Templar ceremonies. The more the Templars refused to discuss their internal practices, the wilder the speculation became. The initiation ceremony was the particular focus of gossip and suspicion. New members were admitted at night, in chapels lit only by candles surrounded by hooded brothers. The ceremony involved taking vows, receiving the habit, and being instructed in the secrets of the order. Standard stuff for a religious order, really, but standard stuff conducted in darkness and secrecy looks very different from standard stuff conducted in daylight with witnesses. What actually happened at these initiations? Based on the Templar rule and various later testimonies, the basic ceremony was fairly straightforward. The candidate was questioned about his qualifications and motivations. He was warned about the hardships of Templar life, the poverty, the obedience, the danger. He took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. He was given the mantle and equipment of his rank. He was instructed in the regulations he would need to follow, and he was welcomed into the Brotherhood with the kiss of peace, a standard medieval gesture of acceptance. But here's where things get complicated. Later, under torture during the suppression of the order, some Templars confessed to bizarre practices during initiation, being required to deny Christ, to spit on the cross, to kiss the officiating brother on improper parts of his anatomy, to worship idols. Were these confessions true revelations of secret corruption within the order? Or were they false statements extracted through unbearable pain, designed to confirm what the interrogators wanted to hear? Historians have debated this for 7 centuries, and there's still no consensus. Some argue that the Templars had developed genuine heretical practices over their 200 years of existence, perhaps influenced by contact with Middle Eastern religions, perhaps as a form of psychological testing for new members, perhaps through simple institutional decay and corruption. Others argue that the confessions were entirely fabricated, products of leading questions and torture, designed to justify a politically motivated destruction of the order. The truth probably lies somewhere in the complicated middle. It's possible that some Templar preceptories developed informal hazing rituals that were crude or inappropriate without being genuinely heretical. Medieval organizations were no strangers to initiation rituals designed to test candidates or create group bonding through shared transgression. What might have been a crude joke in one commandery could become, in the hands of hostile interrogators, evidence of systematic devil worship. What's certain is that the secrecy made the Templars vulnerable. When accusations came, they had no witnesses to their innocence. When rumours spread, they had no way to definitively refute them. The very privacy that had protected their operations and enhanced their mystique became a weapon in the hands of enemies, and enemies they had more and more as the decades passed. Their wealth attracted envy. Their privileges attracted resentment. Their independence, answering only to the Pope, exempt from taxes and local laws, infuriated secular rulers and local clergy alike. Their military failures in the Holy Land, however unfairly blamed on them, damaged their reputation. Their financial power made them seem more like a business than a religious order. The symbols that had once inspired admiration began to inspire suspicion. That white cloak, was it really purity, or was it hypocrisy hiding corruption? That red cross, was it truly willingness to die for Christ, or was it something darker, perhaps even a secret sign of allegiance to forbidden powers? The same mystique that had made the Templars legendary was now making them targets. The Order tried to manage its image, but medieval PR was not exactly a developed field. They continued their traditional practices, maintained their secrets, and probably assumed that their powerful friends and their service to Christendom would protect them indefinitely. They were wrong, because one man was watching all this, the secrecy, the wealth, the vulnerability, and seeing not a venerable religious order but an opportunity. Philip IV of France, whom we've already mentioned, was assembling a case against the Templars that would use their own mystique against them. Every whispered rumour, every suspicious ceremony, every secret meeting would be repackaged as evidence of heresy, blasphemy, and demonic influence. The red cross on white that had once represented the highest ideals of Christian knighthood was about to become Exhibit A in one of the most notorious show trials in medieval history. The anatomy of a legend was about to become the anatomy of a downfall. But before we get to the destruction, we should understand the destroyer. Philip IV wasn't just any king looking for cash. He was a particular kind of ruthless, calculating, utterly immoral political operator who would reshape the relationship between church and state in pursuit of his goals. Understanding him is essential to understanding how the Templars fell and why their fall was so total and so spectacular. The stage was set for tragedy. The players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on the final act of the Templar drama, an act that would involve torture chambers, burning pyres, and a curse that allegedly reached beyond the grave to strike down the men who destroyed the Order. That's coming up next. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. Alright, let's talk about the man who brought down the Templars, because understanding Philip IV of France is essential to understanding how a 200-year-old institution with the Pope's blessing and properties across Europe could be destroyed in a matter of years. Philip wasn't your average medieval king. He was something special, and by special I mean terrifyingly effective, completely immoral, and utterly convinced that whatever he wanted was, by definition, what God wanted too. Historians sometimes call him Philip the Fair, which refers to his appearance rather than his character. The man was apparently quite handsome. He was also, to put it diplomatically, an absolute nightmare of a human being. Philip came to the French throne in 1285 inheriting a kingdom that was powerful but expensive to run. His grandfather, Louis IX, later St. Louis, because he was genuinely pious and went on crusades and generally behaved like a good medieval Christian king should, had left behind a legacy of costly foreign adventures and high expectations. Philip's father, Philip III, had continued the spending without matching the income. By the time Philip IV took over, the royal treasury was looking rather anemic, and the young king had expensive tastes and even more expensive ambitions. Philip wanted to build a strong, centralised French state with the monarchy at its centre, answerable to no one, not local nobles, not the church, nobody. This was a radical vision for the 13th century, when political power was dispersed among feudal lords, cities, and ecclesiastical institutions, all theoretically under the spiritual authority of the Pope. Philip looked at this arrangement and essentially decided it was inconvenient for his plans. He would spend his reign systematically dismantling any institution that limited royal power, and he wouldn't let little things like tradition, law, or basic human decency stand in his way. His first major target was Pope Boniface VIII, and this conflict is crucial for understanding what would later happen to the Templars. Boniface was an old-school pope who believed the papacy stood above all secular rulers. Kings and emperors were subject to papal authority in matters of faith and morals, which in medieval thinking covered basically everything. When Philip tried to tax the French clergy without papal permission, Boniface pushed back hard, issuing papal bulls that asserted church supremacy in increasingly strident terms. Philip's response was unprecedented and shocking. In 1303, he sent a group of armed men to Italy to confront the Pope directly. They found Boniface at his family palace in Anagni, burst in, and by some accounts physically assaulted the elderly pontiff. The exact details are disputed, but the basic fact is clear. A French king had sent goons to rough up the Pope. This was not how medieval politics was supposed to work. Boniface died a month later, possibly from the shock and humiliation. Being beaten up by royal thugs tends to be bad for one's health, especially when you're pushing 70. The message was crystal clear. Philip would destroy anyone who opposed him, regardless of their supposed sacred status. The next few popes got the memo. After a brief pontificate by Benedict XI, The papal conclave elected Clement V, a Frenchman who, surprise, surprise, proved extremely cooperative with Philip's agenda. Clement even moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon in southern France, beginning a period historians call the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, when the supposedly universal church was essentially a French puppet. Philip had brought the Pope to heel. Now he turned his attention to another target. The Templars must have looked incredibly tempting to a man in Philip's position. Here was an organisation that was fabulously wealthy, operated independently of royal authority, and, this is the key part, owed him money. Philip had borrowed heavily from the Templars to finance his various projects, and the prospect of repaying those debts was not appealing. But what if the debts simply disappeared? What if the Templar treasury became the royal treasury? What if those extensive Templar properties across France suddenly belonged to the crown? The challenge was how to pull it off. The Templars answered to the Pope, not the king, so Philip couldn't simply seize their assets through normal legal channels. He needed a justification that would allow him to bypass papal authority, or better yet, force the Pope to cooperate in the order's destruction. He needed accusations so shocking, so terrible, that no one could defend the Templars without appearing to defend the indefensible. Fortunately for Philip, and very unfortunately for the Templars, those rumours about secret ceremonies and strange rituals provided exactly the ammunition he needed. The whispers that had circulated for years about what happened in Templar initiations could be weaponized. Philip began collecting testimony from disgruntled former Templars, from people with grudges against the order, from anyone willing to say what his agents wanted to hear. The accusations were assembled, refined, and prepared for deployment. The charges that emerged were spectacular in their awfulness. The Templars, according to Philip's prosecutors, had been engaged in systematic heresy from the very beginning of the order. New members were required to deny Christ 3 times and spit on the cross as part of their initiation. They worshipped an idol called Baphomet, a strange head or figure whose exact nature varies depending on which testimony you read. They engaged in homosexual acts as part of their rituals. They absolved each other of sins without proper priestly authority. They conducted their ceremonies in secret because they knew their practices were abominations that would horrify ordinary Christians. It was a medieval version of satanic panic, complete with secret rituals, sexual deviance, and worship of demonic entities. And just like modern moral panics, the accusations were designed to be so revolting that merely being associated with them was damning. How do you defend yourself against charges of spitting on the cross? Even denying it makes people wonder if maybe, possibly, there's something to it. The planning for the mass arrest was meticulous. Philip's bureaucrats were nothing if not efficient. Sealed orders were sent to royal officials throughout France with strict instructions not to open them until a specified date. When the day came, every official would open their orders simultaneously and discover they were to arrest every Templar in their jurisdiction, seize all Templar property, and begin interrogations immediately. It was a coordinated nationwide operation that would be impressive even today with modern communications. In 1307, pulling it off required months of secret preparation and flawless execution. The date chosen was Friday, October 13th, 1307. Yes, that Friday the 13th. While historians debate whether this is actually the origin of the superstition about Friday the 13th being unlucky, the coincidence is too delicious not to mention. It was certainly unlucky for the Templars. At dawn on that fateful day, royal soldiers moved simultaneously across France. The Paris Temple, the massive Templar headquarters in the French capital, which had served as the royal treasury and contained enormous wealth, was surrounded and stormed. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was arrested along with dozens of other high-ranking Templars. Across the country, brothers who had gone to sleep as members of one of the most respected organizations in Christendom woke up to find themselves prisoners accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The speed and coordination of the arrests caught the Templars completely off guard. They had powerful friends, extensive resources, and centuries of service to the Church. Surely they were untouchable. Surely someone would intervene, would stop this obvious injustice. The Grand Master himself had been in Paris just days earlier, attending the funeral of a royal family member, treated with full honours as a distinguished guest. The transition from honoured guest to accused heretic happened so fast it must have induced whiplash. Within days of the arrests, the interrogations began. And this is where the story gets truly dark. because medieval interrogation had a tool that modern legal systems have, at least officially, abandoned: judicial torture. The Templars weren't simply questioned. They were subjected to systematic physical abuse designed to produce confessions. The rack stretched joints to the breaking point. Fire was applied to the soles of feet. Sleep deprivation, starvation and isolation wore down psychological resistance. Some Templars had their feet burned so badly that bones fell out, and then were shown those bones during subsequent interrogations as a reminder of what happened to uncooperative witnesses. Under this kind of pressure, people confessed to things. They confessed to true things, false things, impossible things, anything that will make the pain stop. The Templars were no exception. Within weeks of the arrests, confession after confession was being recorded by Philip's clerks. Yes, they had denied Christ. Yes, they had spat on the cross. Yes, they had worshipped idols and engaged in forbidden acts. The details varied. Different Templars gave different accounts of the rituals, which should have been a red flag that they were making things up, but the basic admissions piled up. Philip had what he needed: confessions from the Templars themselves, including from Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master. Now he could present these confessions to the world as evidence of the order's corruption. The Templars stood condemned by their own words, never mind that those words had been extracted through unbearable suffering. Pope Clement V, remember, was supposed to be Philip's puppet, but even he was disturbed by how this was going down. The Templars were a religious order under papal authority. Philip had no right to arrest them without papal permission. Clement made some half-hearted attempts to assert control over the process, demanding that the Templars be handed over to church authorities for proper ecclesiastical trial. Philip basically ignored him. The king had momentum, he had confessions, and he had no intention of letting some inconvenient pope slow things down. The political manoeuvring between Philip and Clement would continue for years, with the pope trying to maintain at least a facade of papal independence, while the king pushed relentlessly for the complete destruction of the order. Clement would eventually cave. He had already demonstrated that he was willing to do what Philip wanted, but the process would be messier and more prolonged than Philip probably hoped. Meanwhile, the arrested Templars found themselves in an impossible situation. Those who had confessed under torture now faced a terrible choice. They could maintain their confessions and hope for mercy, admitting to crimes they may not have committed but at least avoiding further torture. Or they could recant, declare that their confessions had been forced, and insist on their innocence, knowing that recanting a confession was itself a crime that could result in being burned as a relapsed heretic. Confess and live in shame, or recant and risk the fire. Not exactly a menu of attractive options. Some Templars chose to recant. They appeared before papal commissioners, because Clement had at least managed to insert church authorities into the process, and declared that everything they had said under torture was false, that the order was innocent, that they had only confessed, to make the pain stop. These recantations were extremely inconvenient for Philip's narrative, so he dealt with them in characteristically brutal fashion. In May 1310, 54 Templars who had recanted their confessions were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics. The message was unmistakable: recant and die. The flow of recantations slowed dramatically after that. The trial of the Templars dragged on for years, a complicated tangle of royal courts, papal commissions, and local ecclesiastical tribunals, all supposedly investigating the same charges, but often working at cross purposes. The evidence was contradictory, the procedures were questionable, and the outcome was essentially predetermined. Philip wanted the Templars destroyed, and Philip was going to get what he wanted. Outside France, the response to the Templar arrests varied. Some kingdoms followed Philip's lead and arrested their local Templars. Others resisted or conducted their own investigations that often failed to find evidence of the alleged crimes. In England, Edward II initially refused to believe the charges. He had to be pressured repeatedly by Philip before reluctantly beginning arrests. The English interrogations, conducted without the systematic torture used in France, produced far fewer confessions. Funny how that works. But none of this would save the order. Philip had the Pope in his pocket, he had the confessions he needed, and he had demonstrated his willingness to burn anyone who contradicted his narrative. The Templars, those once proud warriors of Christ, had been transformed into accused devil worshippers, their 2 centuries of service erased by accusations that were almost certainly false, but impossible to definitively disprove. The endgame was approaching. The order would be dissolved, its property distributed, mostly not to Philip directly, which must have irritated him, but the debts were cancelled and the rival power centre was eliminated. And at the centre of it all stood two men who would face the flames, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, and his companion in suffering, whose final defiance would transform a judicial murder into an immortal legend. But that's the next chapter. For now, just contemplate the sheer audacity of what Philip had accomplished. He had accused the defenders of Christendom of being its enemies. He had turned the Pope into his accomplice. He had demonstrated that no institution, however ancient or powerful, was safe from a determined king with a good propaganda machine. The Templars had survived Muslim armies, desert heat, and the fall of Jerusalem. They couldn't survive Philip the Fair. So we've established that the Templars were arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to horrifying crimes. But what exactly did those confessions say? And more importantly, what can we actually believe about any of it? This is where the Templar story gets genuinely complicated, because separating truth from torture-induced fiction, 7 centuries after the fact, is basically a historian's nightmare. Buckle up, because we're diving into the murky waters of medieval justice, where the concept of evidence was rather more flexible than we'd prefer. The confessions extracted from the Templars followed a suspicious pattern that any modern detective would recognise as a red flag. The interrogators came equipped with a specific list of charges: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, idol worship, obscene kisses, encouragement of homosexual acts, and wouldn't you know it, the confessions they obtained matched that list almost perfectly. It's almost as if someone was asking leading questions while applying hot irons to sensitive body parts. The medieval version of, "Would you say your organisation worships demons?" Just nod if you'd like us to stop burning your feet. Let's look at some specific confessions, because the details reveal a lot about how this process actually worked. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, initially confessed within days of his arrest. According to the records, he admitted that during his initiation into the order decades earlier, he had been required to deny Christ and spit on an image of the cross. He expressed shame and regret, claimed he had never personally required new initiates to perform these acts, and threw himself on the mercy of the Church. Now, de Molay was in his 60s when arrested, had spent his entire adult life as a Templar, had risen through the ranks to become the supreme leader of the order, and had just days earlier been treated as an honoured guest at a royal funeral. Then he was arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to, at minimum, the threat of torture if not torture itself. Within a week he was confessing to heresy. Draw your own conclusions about how voluntary that confession was. Other confessions were even more revealing in their inconsistencies. Different Templars gave wildly different descriptions of the alleged idol called Baphomet. Some said it was a head with 3 faces, others said it had 1 face. Some said it was made of wood, others of metal. Some described a cat, others a skull covered in human skin. A few claimed it was a painting or carving, while others said it was an actual embalmed head. If the Templars had really been worshipping this idol for 2 centuries across hundreds of commanderies, you'd think they could at least agree on what it looked like. The fact that they couldn't suggests they were making things up on the spot, desperately trying to give their interrogators something, anything, that would make the pain stop. The geographical patterns of the confessions are equally telling. In France, where Philip's agents conducted interrogations using systematic torture, confession rates approached 100%. Virtually every Templar questioned eventually admitted to at least some of the charges. In England, where Edward II initially refused to allow torture and only reluctantly authorised limited use of it years later, confessions were rare and often contained caveats and uncertainties. In Aragon and Castile, Templars consistently denied the charges even under pressure. In Cyprus, where the local Templars had a good relationship with the ruling authorities, investigations found no evidence of wrongdoing at all. It's almost as if the confessions correlated perfectly with how much torture was being applied, rather than with any actual crimes committed. The papal commission that Clement V managed to establish, a small assertion of church authority in a process largely controlled by Philip, provided another revealing data point. When Templars appeared before papal commissioners rather than royal interrogators, many immediately recanted their previous confessions. They said they had only confessed because of the unbearable torment, that the charges were completely false, that the order was innocent. These recantations were often detailed and emotional, with brothers describing exactly what had been done to them and why they had said whatever their torturers wanted to hear. One Templar testified that he had been shown the bones that had fallen from his burned feet during torture. His interrogators told him that if he recanted his confession, they would burn the rest of him to match. He had maintained his false confession out of sheer terror. Another described being kept in chains for months, fed barely enough to survive, constantly threatened with worse treatment if he didn't cooperate. These were not abstract allegations. These were detailed, specific accounts of systematic abuse designed to produce predetermined conclusions. The church commissioners were clearly troubled by what they heard. These were clerics, trained in canon law, theoretically committed to justice and truth. The evidence of torture was impossible to ignore. The inconsistencies in the confessions were obvious. Several commissioners expressed doubts about the entire proceeding in their reports. But what could they do? Philip controlled the prisoners, Philip controlled the enforcement mechanisms, and Philip had already demonstrated his willingness to burn anyone who got in his way. This brings us to the fundamental question that historians have debated for 7 centuries. Were any of the charges against the Templars actually true? The honest answer is, we don't know for certain, and we probably never will. The evidence is hopelessly compromised. Confessions extracted under torture are worthless as historical sources. People will say anything to make extreme pain stop, and the content of those confessions tells us more about what the interrogators wanted to hear than about what actually happened. The recantations suggest innocence, but of course guilty parties would also recant if they thought they could get away with it. The whole evidentiary landscape is a swamp. That said, most modern historians lean toward the view that the charges were largely or entirely fabricated. The political motivations for Philip's attack on the Templars are clear and compelling. He needed money, he wanted to eliminate a rival power centre, he had already demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who opposed him. The pattern of confessions matching torture intensity rather than geography is damning. The lack of any corroborating evidence from outside the coerced testimony is notable. No contemporary accounts, no shocked former members coming forward independently, no documentary evidence of heretical practices in the Order's extensive archives. Some historians have suggested that while the major charges were false, there might have been a kernel of truth in reports of crude initiation rituals. Perhaps some commanderies had developed hazing practices that were inappropriate but not actually heretical. Rough treatment of new members, crude jokes about religious matters, the kind of behaviour that develops in isolated all-male institutions and would look terrible if exposed. This could explain why some Templars seemed uncertain or conflicted in their testimony, why some confessions contained elements that didn't quite fit the official narrative of systematic devil worship. But this is speculation built on speculation. The truth is buried under layers of propaganda, torture, and centuries of legend-making. What we can say with confidence is that the trial was a travesty by any standard of justice, medieval or modern. The outcome was predetermined. The evidence was manufactured, and thousands of men who had dedicated their lives to what they believed was holy service found themselves accused of the exact opposite, tortured until they agreed with their accusers, and then condemned on the basis of those coerced statements. The trial of the Templars is a case study in how power can corrupt truth. Philip wanted the Templars destroyed, and so the Templars would be destroyed, evidence be damned. The confessions served not to reveal what actually happened, but to provide cover for what Philip intended to do anyway. They were props in a political theatre, not genuine investigations of fact. So where was the Pope in all of this? Clement V, remember, was supposed to be the Templars' protector. They answered to papal authority, not royal authority. They had served the Church loyally for 2 centuries. Surely the Vicar of Christ would defend them against this obvious injustice. Well, about that. Clement V was in an impossible position, and to understand his choices, which look pretty terrible from a modern perspective, you have to understand just how constrained his options really were. On one hand, he was technically the supreme spiritual authority in Christendom, the successor to St. Peter, the shepherd of all Christian souls. On the other hand, he was a French pope who owed his election to French influence. He had moved the papal court to French territory, and Philip had already demonstrated what happened to popes who defied him. Clement had seen what happened to Boniface VIII. He had no desire to experience something similar. The result was years of elaborate diplomatic manoeuvring, with Clement trying to maintain the appearance of papal independence, while consistently failing to actually protect the Templars from Philip's assault. He made protests, issued demands, convened commissions, and none of it changed the fundamental trajectory of events. Philip wanted the Templars destroyed, and Philip was going to get what Philip wanted. Clement's initial response to the arrests was indignation, or at least the performance of indignation. He complained that Philip had acted without papal authorization, that the Templars were a religious order under church jurisdiction, that proper procedures had not been followed. He demanded that the prisoners and their property be handed over to church authorities. He threatened consequences. Philip essentially ignored him. The king had confessions now, those torture-extracted admissions that gave his actions a veneer of legitimacy. He pointed to the Templars' own words as proof of their guilt. He argued that the crimes were so severe, so urgent, that immediate action had been necessary. He kept the prisoners in royal custody, continued the interrogations, and dared Clement to actually do something about it. What Clement did was compromise. He couldn't prevent Philip from pursuing the Templars, but he could insert church authorities into the process to maintain at least some control. He established papal commissions to conduct their own investigations, operating alongside the royal tribunals. He suspended the French bishop's authority to try Templars, trying to concentrate power in his own hands. He convened a general council of the Church, the Council of Vienne, scheduled for 1310, where the fate of the Templars would be decided. But every time Clement made a move toward asserting independence, Philip pushed back and Clement retreated. When Templars recanted their confessions before papal commissioners, declaring their innocence and describing their torture, Philip arranged for 54 of them to be burned as relapsed heretics. The message was clear: cooperate or watch more men die. Clement got the message. The Council of Vienne, when it finally convened in 1311, was supposed to be the venue for a fair hearing on the Templar question. Bishops and other church authorities from across Europe gathered to consider the evidence and render judgment. In theory, this was the Church exercising its proper authority, conducting a legitimate ecclesiastical process, determining truth through debate and deliberation. In practice, Philip stage-managed the entire thing. He arrived at Vienne with an army, a not-so-subtle reminder of what happened to church authorities who displeased him. He demanded immediate dissolution of the Templar order without further trial. He implied that if the council didn't comply, there might be unpleasant consequences. The council fathers were divided. Many bishops expressed doubts about the evidence against the Templars. The confessions were obviously coerced. The regional variations in testimony were suspicious. Some argued that the order should be given a proper opportunity to defend itself, that representatives should be allowed to present their case, that justice required more than rubber-stamping Philip's predetermined conclusion. A group of Templars actually showed up at Vienne, hoping to present a defense of their order. This was extraordinarily brave. These were men who knew perfectly well what Philip did to Templars who challenged the official narrative. They came anyway, prepared to argue for their brotherhood's innocence before the assembled leaders of Christendom. Clement refused to hear them. He was terrified of what Philip might do if the council actually started listening to Templar testimony, if the bishops actually started questioning the charges, if the whole carefully constructed case started falling apart. In March 1312, Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, a voice from on high, which officially suppressed the Templar order. Notably, he did not condemn the Templars as guilty. The language was careful. The order was being dissolved not because it had been proven guilty of heresy, but because its reputation had been so damaged that it could no longer effectively serve the Church. There was enough suspicion, enough scandal, enough controversy that the order had become useless regardless of the actual truth of the charges. It was a masterpiece of cowardly equivocation. Clement couldn't quite bring himself to declare the Templars guilty. The evidence didn't support it, and he knew it. But he also couldn't bring himself to declare them innocent. Philip would have made him pay for that. So he found a middle path: dissolve the order without actually ruling on its guilt, call it a practical decision rather than a moral judgment, and hope history would blame someone else. A subsequent bull, ad providam, transferred Templar properties to the Knights Hospitaller, the other great military order that had escaped Philip's wrath. In theory, this meant Philip didn't directly benefit from the seizure. The wealth went to another church organisation, not to the royal treasury. In practice, Philip managed to extract enormous expenses and costs from the transfer. and of course those debts he owed the Templars simply evaporated with the order that had held them. The king came out very much ahead, which was the whole point. As for individual Templars, their fates varied. Those who had confessed and maintained their confessions were technically reconciled to the Church, assigned penances, often imprisoned for life, but not executed. Those who had recanted faced harsher treatment, though after the dissolution there was less urgency to pursue them. Many former Templars simply disappeared into obscurity, trying to build new lives away from the wreckage of their order. Some joined other religious orders, some returned to secular life, a few made their way to other countries where they hadn't been persecuted. The institutional wealth of the Templars, accumulated over 2 centuries of donations and careful management, was dispersed. The Hospitallers, suddenly enriched with Templar properties across Europe, became even more powerful, though they also inherited Templar debts and legal complications. The Templar banking network collapsed, its sophisticated financial infrastructure dismantled. The commanderies that had dotted the European landscape were transferred, repurposed, or abandoned. And the mission that had founded the order, protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land, was rendered moot anyway. The last Crusader stronghold at Acre had fallen to the Mamluks in 1291, 16 years before the arrests. There was no longer a Christian presence in the Holy Land to protect. The Templars had outlived their original purpose, which made them vulnerable to an attack they might otherwise have survived. Pope Clement V would not live long to enjoy whatever satisfaction he felt at resolving the Templar crisis. He died in April 1314, just 2 years after suppressing the order and 1 month after the burning of Jacques de Molay. Medieval chroniclers reported that his death was preceded by illness and misery, that he died knowing he had betrayed men who trusted in his protection, that his final days were haunted by guilt and fear. Whether that's true or just legend-making by later writers sympathetic to the Templars is impossible to say. What is certain is that Clement's papacy was not remembered kindly. He had moved the papal court to France, subordinated church interest to Philip's demands, and dissolved one of the most prestigious religious orders in Christendom based on obviously fabricated charges. His legacy was that of a weak pope who failed to stand up for justice when it mattered most. Philip IV, meanwhile, had achieved most of his objectives. The Templars were gone, his debts were cancelled. A potential rival power centre had been eliminated. He had demonstrated that no institution in France, not even one protected by the Pope, was safe from royal authority. The centralised French state he envisioned was one step closer to reality. But Philip's triumph was about to be shadowed by something none of his political calculations had anticipated. In the smoke rising from a burning pyre on an island in the Seine, a condemned man would speak words that would echo through centuries, a curse, a prophecy, a final act of defiance that would transform judicial murder into immortal legend. The Grand Master was about to have the last word. We've reached the moment that transforms a political persecution into an immortal legend. March 18th, 1314, a platform erected in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. A crowd gathered to witness what was supposed to be a routine announcement of sentencing, and an old man who had endured 7 years of imprisonment, torture, and degradation, about to do something that no one expected, something that would echo through centuries. Jacques de Molay had been Grand Master of the Templars for over 20 years when he was arrested on that fateful Friday in 1307. He was probably around 70 years old by the time of his final public appearance, ancient by medieval standards, especially considering the conditions he'd endured. 7 years in various prisons, subjected to interrogation and physical abuse, watching his order destroyed around him, seeing his brothers burned for daring to recant their coerced confessions. Whatever fight the old warrior had left in him, most observers probably assumed it had been thoroughly extinguished. The plan for that March day was simple. De Molay and 3 other high-ranking Templars, Geoffrey de Charny, Hugh de Perrot, and Geoffrey de Gonneville, were to be publicly sentenced based on their confessions. They had admitted to the charges against them. They had maintained those admissions despite opportunities to recant. The Church Commission handling their case had decided on perpetual imprisonment, harsh but survivable. The sentence would be announced, the crowd would disperse, the Templars would be carted off to spend their remaining days in dungeons, and that would be that. Case closed. The platform was set up near the cathedral, in full view of a substantial crowd. Parisians loved a good public spectacle, and the final sentencing of the notorious Templar leaders certainly qualified. Cardinal legates were present to officially pronounce the sentences on behalf of the church. Royal officials watched to ensure everything proceeded according to plan. This was supposed to be the final act of a drama that had played out over 7 years, the formal, public conclusion to the Templar affair. The Cardinal began reading the sentences. Life imprisonment for all 4 men. They had confessed to terrible crimes against the faith. They had been shown mercy by the Church, which had not demanded their deaths. They would spend their remaining years in confinement, contemplating their sins. It was over, except it wasn't. As the Cardinal finished speaking, Jacques de Molay did something that stunned everyone present. He stepped forward and spoke. He declared that the confessions were false. He said he had lied under torture, that the order was innocent, that the Templars had never committed the crimes they were accused of. He retracted everything he had said during 7 years of coerced testimony and proclaimed the innocence of himself and his brotherhood before God and the assembled crowd. Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy and one of the most senior Templars after de Molay, joined him in this recantation. 2 old men, broken by years of imprisonment, standing before a crowd and the power of church and state, choosing this moment to finally tell the truth as they understood it. The other 2 condemned Templars, Péraud and Gonneville, did not join the recantation. They kept their silence, accepted their sentences, and would spend their remaining years in prison. Their choice is understandable. They had seen what happened to men who recanted. The 54 brothers burned in 1310 were a vivid reminder of the consequences. But de Molay and de Charny had apparently decided that they were done playing along with a lie, whatever the cost. The reaction was immediate chaos. The carefully orchestrated ceremony had gone completely off script. The cardinal legates were furious and probably terrified. This was not supposed to happen, and they had no protocol for dealing with it. The crowd was buzzing with shock and confusion. And word reached King Philip IV almost immediately, because of course someone ran to tell the king that the Templars were causing problems even at their own sentencing. Philip's response was swift and predictable. These men had recanted their confessions, which under medieval law made them relapsed heretics. The punishment for relapsed heresy was death by burning. There would be no appeals, no second trial, no opportunity for the men to reconsider. That very evening, the same day as the recantation, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny were taken to a small island in the Seine River called the Île aux Juifs, near the royal gardens, and burned at the stake. The execution happened at dusk, which was unusual. Most burnings were conducted during daylight for maximum public visibility and deterrent effect. The haste suggests that Philip wanted these men dead before anyone could intervene, before the Pope could potentially claim jurisdiction, before public sympathy could organise around the dramatic recantation. It was a rushed execution, designed to silence de Molay before he could say anything else inconvenient. But if Philip thought he could silence the Grand Master by burning him, he was badly mistaken. According to multiple chroniclers, de Molay spoke from the flames. The exact words vary depending on the source, but the gist was consistent. He called upon God to witness his innocence and the innocence of his order, and he summoned both Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before God's tribunal within a year, to answer for their crimes. Was this literally true? Did de Molay actually pronounce a formal curse while burning to death? Or is this a legend that developed afterward, as people processed the dramatic events and looked for meaning in the tragedy? We can't know for certain. What we can say is that the story of de Molay's curse took hold almost immediately, and has persisted for 7 centuries. Whether it started as actual words spoken from the pyre, or as a narrative that people constructed to make sense of what happened, it became an essential part of the Templar story. The manner of de Molay's death also became legendary. According to some accounts, he asked to be positioned facing Notre Dame Cathedral so he could pray as he died. He reportedly maintained his composure throughout the execution, dying with the dignity of a warrior and a man of faith. Whether these details are historically accurate or hagiographic embellishment, they contributed to the image of de Molay as a martyr rather than a criminal, a man unjustly murdered by a corrupt king and a cowardly pope. The ashes of the last Grand Master were reportedly collected by his supporters during the night and preserved as relics. Again, this may be legend rather than history, but it reflects how quickly de Molay was transformed from condemned heretic to martyred saint in popular imagination. The man Philip had tried to destroy became, in death, more powerful than he had ever been in life. Now for the part that makes this story genuinely eerie. Within a year of Desmoulins' execution, both of his alleged targets were dead. Pope Clement V died on April 20th, 1314, barely a month after the burning. He had been ill for some time, but the timing was remarkable enough to raise eyebrows even among people who didn't necessarily believe in curses. The man who had dissolved the Templar Order, who had failed to protect innocent men from a rapacious king, who had traded justice for political survival, he was gone before the year was half over. King Philip IV followed on November 29th, 1314. He was only 46 years old. The official cause was a hunting accident. He suffered a stroke while riding, or possibly fell from his horse. Some chronicles hint at other possibilities, but the bottom line is clear. The king who had destroyed the Templars was dead within 8 months of burning their Grand Master. The curse, if curse it was, had claimed both of its targets well within the promised year. Coincidence? Almost certainly. Medieval life expectancy wasn't great. Popes died all the time, and kings faced various occupational hazards. From a purely rational perspective, there's nothing supernatural about two middle-aged men dying within months of each other in an era when infectious disease and medical ignorance could kill anyone at any time. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and this pattern was too compelling to ignore. The story of Desmoulins' curse spread rapidly, gaining details and dramatic emphasis as it travelled. Within a generation, it was established legend. Within a century, it was accepted as historical fact by many who heard it. The curse became the definitive ending to the Templar story, not just a judicial murder, but divine vengeance reaching from beyond the grave. And the curse, some said, didn't stop with Clement and Philip. The Capetian dynasty itself seemed to fall under its shadow. Philip IV's 3 sons all became kings of France: Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV. And all 3 died without surviving male heirs. By 1328, just 14 years after Desmoulins' execution, the direct Capetian line was extinct. The throne passed to a cousin, Philip VI of the House of Valois, and this disputed succession would help trigger the 100 Years' War between France and England. France would spend the next century torn apart by warfare, plague, and civil strife. Was this the Templar curse at work? The rational answer is no. Dynastic failures and succession crises were common in medieval Europe, and the Black Death would have devastated France regardless of what happened to the Templars. But rationality has never stopped a good legend, and the story that the Templars' destruction brought ruin upon France persisted for centuries. This brings us to the broader question of Templar legacy, not just the curse, but everything the Order has become in the 7 centuries since Desmoulins' death. Because here's the thing, the Templars didn't really die in 1314. The organisation was dissolved, the members scattered, the property confiscated, but the idea of the Templars, the mystique, the legend, that proved indestructible. In some ways, the Templars have been more influential dead than they ever were alive. The secrecy that had made the Templars vulnerable to Philip's accusations became the foundation for centuries of speculation. What had really gone on behind closed doors? What secrets had the Order possessed? What knowledge had they accumulated during 2 centuries in the Holy Land? In the absence of definitive answers, imagination filled the void. The first major reinvention of the Templars came with Freemasonry in the 18th century. Various Masonic traditions claimed descent from the Templars, suggesting that the Order had survived its official suppression by going underground, transmitting secret knowledge through initiatic rituals passed down through generations. There's no historical evidence for any actual connection between medieval Templars and early modern Freemasons, but that didn't stop the legend from taking hold. Masonic Templarism created elaborate mythologies linking the lodges to the warrior monks, complete with rituals, symbols, and hierarchies that claimed Templar ancestry. From Freemasonry, the Templar legend spread into popular culture. 19th century Romanticism loved the Templars: mysterious knights, tragic martyrs, keepers of secret wisdom, perfect fodder for novels, poems, and operas. Sir Walter Scott featured Templars in several of his historical novels, cementing their place in popular imagination. The image of the white-cloaked knight with the red cross became iconic, instantly recognizable, loaded with associations of mystery and adventure. The 20th and 21st centuries brought the Templars into new territories. Conspiracy theories proliferated. The Templars had discovered the Holy Grail. The Templars had found the Ark of the Covenant. The Templars had uncovered secrets about Jesus that would shake Christianity to its foundations. Dan Brown's novels, particularly The Da Vinci Code, introduced millions of readers to a fictionalized version of Templar history that blended real events with wild speculation. Video games, movies, and television shows made the Templars villains, heroes, and everything in between. The irony is thick here. An organization that was destroyed partly because of rumors and speculation about its secret practices has become, in death, the subject of even wilder rumors and speculation. The mystery that medieval critics invented as an accusation has become, in the modern era, the Templars' greatest asset. People are drawn to secrets, to hidden knowledge, to the idea that powerful forces operate behind the scenes of history. The Templars, with their combination of real historical importance and manufactured mystique, are perfect vessels for these fantasies. Meanwhile, serious historians have worked to separate fact from fiction, reconstructing what we actually know about the medieval Templars from documentary evidence. This scholarship has produced a picture of the order that is less romantic but more human, an organization of real people with real motivations, operating within the constraints of their time, achieving remarkable things and also making mistakes. The true history of the Templars is less dramatic than the legends but arguably more interesting, because it involves actual human beings rather than cardboard cutouts from adventure stories. The Templar legacy also lives on in unexpected places. Their innovations in finance, the letter of credit, the international banking network, were genuine contributions to economic development. Some historians argue that Templar financial practices helped lay groundwork for the commercial revolution of the later Middle Ages. Their military innovations, disciplined cavalry tactics, fortification design, logistics management, influenced warfare for generations. Even their organizational structure, with its combination of central authority and local autonomy, provided models for later international institutions. And then there's the moral legacy, the story of what happens when power goes unchecked, when justice is subordinated to political expedience, when an institution can be destroyed through propaganda and torture. The trial of the Templars is studied in law schools as an example of how not to conduct legal proceedings. It's cited in discussions of false confessions, of the unreliability of testimony obtained through torture, of the dangers of allowing political considerations to corrupt judicial processes. Philip IV won his battle against the Templars, but history has not been kind to his methods. The Templars, in the end, achieved something their persecutors never imagined: immortality. Not the literal immortality of legend, where hidden Templar cells supposedly wait in secret for the right moment to reveal themselves, but the cultural immortality of a story so compelling, so layered with meaning and mystery that it refuses to be forgotten. 9 centuries after a handful of knights started protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads, we're still talking about them. We're still arguing about what really happened. We're still finding new ways to tell their story. That's not a bad legacy for an organization that officially ceased to exist in 1312. So what have we learned from this whole epic journey? The Templars were warriors who became bankers, monks who became millionaires, servants of God who became victims of political ambition. They rose from humble origins to become one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world, and they fell victim to a king who wanted their wealth and a pope too weak to protect them. Their story encompasses the highest ideals and the basest treachery, the noblest sacrifice and the cruelest persecution. And their story continues, in books and movies, in conspiracy theories and academic conferences, in the imagination of everyone who hears about white-cloaked knights and red crosses and treasures hidden in the Holy Land. The Templars died 7 centuries ago, but in every sense that matters, they're still very much with us. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride through medieval history. If you made it this far, you're officially a Templar scholar, or at least someone with excellent taste in historical content. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments. Do you think de Molay's curse was real, or just the most dramatic coincidence in medieval history? I'll see you in the next one.